Hi everyone. Once again, welcome for the first Epsilon Shiny conference. I'm so happy to see so many people from all around the world. Our first topic of the day is dynamically adding and removing shiny modules by Jonas Hagenberg from Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry. This is a pre-recorded session and feel free to ask any questions in the chat and we'll make sure that they are answered in the chat or later, presumably in a blog post. And if you're in mood for networking, you can join the Shiny Roundtable session from the left nav bar. Here we go.
Welcome everyone to the tutorial Dynamically Adding and Removing Shiny Modules here at the Epsilon Shiny Conference. Before I start, I just want to mention that all the code I'm showing you today and some additional information is available on this repository here at GitHub. Okay, then let's start and talk about dynamic modules. So when you're using modules in your Shiny app, these modules are either called when you initialize a Shiny app. So basically, you as a programmer exactly determine where they are used, or they can be dynamically called due to user input while the Shiny app is already running. And dynamic modules can be useful when something has to be repeated based on user input. This could be, for example, if you want to show several plots or tables and don't know beforehand how many should be shown, or maybe also a set of UI elements, again, based on user inputs. And I want to say this in the beginning that if you're using this dynamic modules, it can become complex quite easily. So I recommend to use it a bit with care and only really when you need it. And yeah, I would say let's check it out how we can get from static modules to dynamic modules. And first, I want to start with how to dynamically add modules. And for this, I have prepared a short Shiny app with one module. So here you see the module UI, where you have a select input, where you can select a plot type, box plot or histogram, and then you have the plot output here. And then the server function for this module, where we render the plot, a ggplot, and based on our input, we either get a box plot or a histogram. And to start with this app, I have a very simple Shiny app here. In the UI, I just call the module UI once, and also once then the server function of this module. And when we run this app, it looks like this. So you see this plot here, but only once. Okay, and now we want to get to the point where we can dynamically add this. So first, let's remove this hard-coded here in our app and start with an action button in our main app, which says, okay, that we can add a module. So input ID, add module, and give it also a label. So this is our start, and then we need an observe event to listen to this add module, and then something should be done here. And actually the first part to insert the server function of a module, for this we can just call the graph server function. We need to give it an ID, and let's start with the static ID and come back to this later. And this is already the part where we want to add the server part of the module, and now also we need to add the UI part. And for this, there's a function called insert UI we can use. First, it needs a selector, and I will come to this in a minute, what this is, and also the UI part of what we want to add. And here we add the UI part of our module. Okay, let's quickly have a look at what this selector is. So selectors are used in jQuery, which is the JavaScript framework used by Shiny, and these selectors are based on CSS selectors. And with this, you can select or define rules on what you want to select in your Shiny app. You could, for example, select element types, so you could select all buttons or all divs. And what is relevant for us is that you can also select single elements by ID. And we can use this now in the Shiny app to select one element in our app where we want to add this new UI part from our modules. And actually the easiest for us is if we add a div element in our main Shiny app UI part and give it an ID, for example, add here, and then use this selector. So we have to prefix it if we want to select an ID with this hashtag sign and then add here. And so we can basically say when we want to insert the UI part, say, okay, insert it at this place in our Shiny app. Okay, now let's check it out. So now we have this button to add a module. We can click add a module, which is nice. But now if you want to add a second module, it does not work properly. And this is because so far we've used the static ID for our modules, and actually this does not work in Shiny. Every module has needs to have its own ID. And so we should basically increment this ID every time we want to add another module. And so for us, the easiest solution is actually to use the value of this action button add module, because it returns the number of how often this action button was clicked so far. So we can just use this to generate a unique ID and just use paste 0, maybe prefixes with ID underscore, and then use input add module. And then we need the same also here for the UI part. Okay, now let's check it out. Same as before. Can add one module, and then we can also add a second module. Yeah, and now this works. So let us recap what you have to do when you want to add modules. You first need to call the module server function. You use the insert UI function to add the module UI elements. While doing this, you need to use an appropriate selector and where in the main Shiny app you want to insert the UI elements. For us, the easiest is just to use an empty div with an ID element. And every module which we add, or every module instance, needs to have its own unique ID. Okay, so far for adding modules. But how does it look like when we want to also remove modules? So as there's an insert UI function, there's also a remove UI function we can use. And for this remove UI function, we just have to provide a selector which UI elements we want to remove. This works really well when we just, for example, want to remove one UI element, for example, one insert UI one select input, for example, something like this. But it does not really work when we have several UI elements, for example, as in our case, in the module UI part. So one solution for this is to change something how we wrap these module UI parts. So usually here you would use a tag list, right? To wrap all your ID elements, UI elements. But what we can do instead, as I've shown here, is to use a div. And we can give this div an ID, and as an ID, we just use the module ID. And then it works when we want to use this to remove a module. And let's see how this looks like in the app. So now, here in our app, in the UI part, we have to start going from this tag list to the div and use our module ID. This is the first part. Then we need now we are in our main Shiny app. We need an action button for removing a module. Give it a label. Okay. And now here we have the observe event for add a module. Now we have to add the observe event to remove a module. Okay, remove module. Okay. And as I said, we can use this remove UI and then give it a selector. But now actually is the question, what, which selector, so basically which module ID do we have to provide here? What is the latest one? And yeah, so far we've just generated on the fly with this paste with the prefix of the ID here, and then this value of the action button. But now we somehow have to keep track, which is actually the latest ID which of the module we want to remove. And while you could do it just basically a counter where you increment and decrement the module IDs, I would recommend to actually use unique IDs for every module instance that is created, because otherwise I've already run into some troubles with some states still somewhere stored in Shiny, which leads to some weird displaying issues when you just in the first second after you add a new module. So I recommend to use unique IDs for every module. And for what I have to do for this is to basically add an extra variable, a list where I keep track of all the modules that are actively shown in the Shiny app, so that we basically know, okay, these are the IDs of the modules shown, and also which is basically the first element in the list is the latest added module, so that we know, okay, this is also then the ID we want to remove. And for this, I use an reactive var. Let's call it active modules, reactive var, and initialize it with null. Okay. And basically now, because now obviously this also has to be taken into account when we add a module. So let's start here. And yeah, because this input add module only increments, adds up, so we can still use this to create the ID of a new added element, and then just call it current ID and store this in our list of active modules. Here, so basically we add the current ID as the first element of the list, and then just add the rest of the modules shown right now in the Shiny app. And then we can just use our current ID variable here. And also again here. Okay, this is what we need to do when we add a module. And now when we want to remove the module, we can use this active modules list to retrieve the latest or the ID of the latest module, which should then be removed. So here again, current ID. And now we can just use the first element of this list. Actually, I store it as a vector. because this is the ID of the latest module. So basically, in our case in the app, the one which is on the bottom. And then use this here in the selector for remove UI. However, we again, because this is an ID of an element, we need to prefix it with this hashtag sign, and then we can use this current ID. And after we've removed this, now we also need to update our active modules list, and basically just remove the first element because this is the model we've just removed. Okay, and we also want to make sure that we don't remove any more modules that are on the screen. So we only do this here if there are actually still some modules left. So let's add an if clause if the length of this active modules list is if this is greater than 0, only then we want to remove a module. So let's copy this here. Okay, and let's see how this looks like. So we can add a module, remove a module, and now don't remove any more modules that are actually on the screen. Okay, so this works out. And let's do a quick recap. So when you want to remove the UI part of the module, you use remove UI. You need to create a selector with a hashtag sign and the module ID of the module you want to remove. And I recommend to really use a unique ID for every module. However, this was only stuff basically on the client side, but we haven't changed anything on the server side. Basically just remove the UI elements. However, on the server side, we still have values in this input variable of Shiny reactors, and there can also be some observe events still listening in the server part. And if they keep accumulating because you dynamically add more modules, remove them, add again even more modules, they add up and can negatively influence the performance. So it is recommended to also remove these. And today I'm going to show you a way how to remove basically leftovers in the input variable on Shiny on the server side, because they are still stored, and if they accumulate, they can consume, especially if they have a lot of a very big variable, they can consume a lot of memory of your Shiny server. And there's a really nice post by Thomas Rohe, please check it out, where he writes a function which can actually remove these leftover input values. So basically what this function does is that it takes the module ID of the module you want to remove, and in this dot input variable you pass the input variable in the Shiny server. And then first it finds all variables from the module, because they are all prefixed with the module ID, and then here in this input variable called input, all these values are then removed. And let's check it out how this works in practice. So let's copy this, and here now add this to our Shiny app. And I want to show you what happens before we actually use this. So here in this input remove module, I now add a browser that we can see what happens when we only remove the UI part. So let's run this app. I add a module, and now I remove the module. Okay. And now here in the browser, and now we can print actually how this input element looks like, and you can see that we have this this variable here, which is prefixed by these by the module ID of the module we've just removed, and it's still there in the input. And now it's not a big variable, but it still accumulates, and it's still there. For example, if we now add another module, remove it, and then print the input, as you can see, it's still there. And then we now have also the input from the next module we've just added and removed. And now, basically, we can just here call this remove shiny inputs function. The ID is the ID of the module we just removed. So here I've called it current ID, and the dot input variable is our shiny input. And now let's check it out what happens when we run this. Okay, add a module, remove it, and now again print the input. And as you can see, we've run the remove shiny function before we got into this breakpoint. And as you see, there's no input value left, which belongs to the module we've just removed. So this works. And if you want, and then you can remove the browser again to have a functioning shiny app, which you could put into production. Okay. Now, what you can also do, and I don't have the time today to talk about this, is to destroy observe events which are registered in the module server code. There's a really nice Epsilon blog post about this. Based on this blog post, I've compiled some additional information, which you can find in the additional information section in the repository for this talk. So yeah, please check it out and see how you can do this. Okay, so to summarize everything I've talked about, you can use the insert UI and the remove UI functions for the module UI part to dynamically edit and remove it. However, this is not enough, especially for removing. You also need to remove the input variables, just as I've shown you, and it's also recommended to destroy observe events so that you can avoid some performance issues on your Shiny server. I also recommend to use unique IDs for every module instance to avoid problems that could pop up when you reuse module IDs. And as I said in the beginning, as you can see, that it adds some complexity if you want to have this dynamic behavior. I recommend to only use it sparingly. And with this, thank you very much for your attention.